How are you doing, Mr. President?
I am doing well. Thank you for asking. This has been an extraordinarily challenging yet interesting year, one that I absolutely do not want to repeat ever again. Okay, I have no need to revisit a pandemic. I was hoping we could have avoided in our century, but I guess we couldn't. So it is what it is. You know, if you remember the show West, am I being taped now? You might as well go
Yes,
with
we're,
it.
we're, we're on. We're on.
All right,
Scott got us going.
Scott is wonderful. West Wing. I don't know if you ever watched the show West Wing.
Yeah, yeah.
I think in the third or fourth of the first year, the fourth show of the first year, they talked about the greatest. I mean, I think Martin Sheen in his role as the pilot talked about the a pandemic and how that would be the greatest, greatest threat to everything. And lo and behold, we have one just 10 or 12 years later, and he certainly did not overstate its implications. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And it's peaking right now. Again, I think once we get through this, and then the vaccine but it's still going to be, we're not going to get through this spring. We hopefully by fall, we'll have some degree of normalcy again. I think we will have much closer to normal, but there's going to be a new normal. That's something that actually I'm going to be speaking with the Leadership Council later in the week about, because we have to begin to think about that world.
Have you
As we
seen
think about all the other worlds that we've had. What?
Have you seen the New York Times vaccine line thing?
Yeah, I've seen in your vaccine. Well, what do you mean? Have I seen it?
Yeah. When you're have you seen this in the New York Times? You put in your age, you put in your county, and you put in a couple of other pieces of information and push a button, and it will tell you what your position is in Atlantic County for getting vaccine.
You know what? I'm going to do that right now. I did not see that, and I get the New York Times. Is that horrible?
Wonderful.
Where is it? What? Oh, I'm on tape here.
I'll send you a link.
Okay, well, that would be nice. You should have done that right away. You should have done this when you got it. Said maybe the president would like to know when he's going to get a shot.
Yeah, well, I figure such things. So
well, I usually do actually, but I'm into more of the micro level right now, not the Harvey level here.
Listen, on days that it gets really bad for you, it's just a personal opinion now. I think you and your staff is going to come out as heroic.
We're going to come out heroic.
You're going to come out heroic.
Well, I think actually I think we've done as good a job as anyone certainly in this state has. I think the timing of everything, we did it. We pulled out at the very right moment when we closed down. We kept a lid on it. And by that, I mean, we kept students safe. I think students were great. I think the messaging was consistent. We tried to keep faculty and staff updated. It was Herculean because it's most, and I guess this speaks a little bit to the presidency and having been a vice president of every area and a dean and all the other things, I've been. I have a different vantage point than most presidents because I've experienced, everything on a college or university campus at different levels. And like a lot of times the things in student affairs really negatively impact presidents that do not have that in their background. They just get stymied by those kinds of events because they've never really had to confront it, particularly new ones. Right? Once you've done it once or twice, you get past it. But this is so unlike anything else that I've ever confronted in any role. And I am a problem solver by nature, and you guys know that. But it was, I didn't even know, we didn't know, and it really was a collective action. We were getting, we obviously had to abide by what the governor was doing, okay? And yet our voice, and specifically Stockton's voice, clearly were heard in the arguments because I kept arguing from the beginning, don't treat us all the same. I said, because some of us are better positioned than other ones to move through this. And I always believed that and one of the reasons why I did shut it down after Thanksgiving is because I knew they would go home. As long as they could stay here, and many of our students were staying here, I was pretty comfortable we could keep a lid on it. But the moment they could go at home, then there was, all bets were off. And that's exactly what's happening, as you can see now. But over the time, I think that because no one knew, I mean, look, when you think about where we started in March, and I thought the governor did a great job too, quite frankly. I mean, it was a hard job, and it was not, and it was a job that was controversial, and it was political, particularly down here, because we are, as I always say, we're the bluest entity in the reddest part of the bluest state. And so, you know, we're in the middle of a very different way of looking at the world that was maybe not the same as how the governor looked at the world. And we were much more aligned with how he was looking at the world. But we had to make some, I thought, you know, difficult choices. We tried to do it in conjunction with, you know, as many people as possible, the various committees we formed and the like, to get as much input as we could. But at the end, you know, we're in the right town. I mean, it's a crapshoot. You've got to be sure that decisions you've made, you can logically defend. And so that was, I think, the largest. And you know, there were many. I've got as little as I sleep normally. It's been less since March, but I've been here. I've been in two places, Ken, really, my home and here. That's it. I don't go shopping, any of that. Lynn takes care, which I couldn't do it without her. I really couldn't. But I said I would be safe if I were here and I were home. That were the only two places I knew I could be safe. And but I did think there needed to be a presence here because we had to keep the trains running. There was about 6 or 7 of us that were here, whether it was Scott was one of them, obviously, Chris Ketching, VP Student Affairs, that were here to make sure, you know, the place didn't completely close. And of course, my other role as the chair of the New Jersey President's Council, you add that onto it, you know, which was, you know, because I can't just always be Stockton centric when I'm in that role. I have to be, you know, broader. It's been an incredible challenge, but I've learned a lot more. And Laurie Herndon, by the way, Atlantic Care, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful colleagues through this. Making sure she knew, she said, you know, and one of the quotes, I don't know, she said, you know, I know, and she would say this, I thought it was bad running a hospital. I can't imagine what it's like to run the campus because you got thousands of students living there, 10,000 people coming in and out, thousands of guests and everything else. And you know what was great, and you never knew when we had gout. One of the things we have, and this is what I was saying to the governor that other entities do not. Number one, we didn't build vertically; we built horizontally. So everything we're spaced out really well to begin with. Don Hudson and his staff did an incredible job putting in plexiglass. If you visited the campus, Ken, you wouldn't believe it. The office, I mean, we redid, it was millions of dollars, but we redid literally every single office has, like, you know, not faculty, but I'm talking, you know, all the school offices and things like that. All the public spaces have, you know, incredible signage, plexiglass, everything, you know, hand sanitizers, all the free masks, everything, and all the things that we said we would do. And, you know, when the students came back in September, you know, we had a few, you know, normal kinds of knuckleheads, the governor would call it, acted out the first week. We addressed it right away. We gave them 2 weeks off. We said, now you're going to 2 weeks off. If you want to come back, you come back. That settled everything down right away. We didn't want to be heavy-handed, but we wanted the people to know we were serious. That if you're going to party, you're going to leave. We're going to close the place up, and you're going to jeopardize it. The upper class students were great because they got it, they understood it. And yet they came, I met with them, I met with a lot of the student leadership to get their input. What works, how should we communicate with students? You know, social media, what is it they want to do because they don't read email and things like that. So, I mean, it was a real university-wide effort. And then of course, when you get into the faculty, I mean, I can't even imagine. I mean, you know, I was thinking myself, if I were teaching, what kind of a shift would that be for me to go from, particularly like when you talk about the March where we literally did it overnight, and then, you know, what a heavy lift that is. And particularly if you're like, I think the three of us are, and we get energized by that interaction that you can't completely mirror online. You can do some of it, but you can't do all of it. So I think with what the faculty had to go through, the staff had to go through, our students, that knock on wood, you know, if you look at our numbers, and we've had them up there since day one, we were one of the first schools to put it up there. We've kept them where they needed to be. And with the most students we ever had in gout, I had said quietly internally that if we filled up gout, which would have been 44 rooms, okay, and we had a single per room. Remember, we had Atlantic Care doctors and nurses in there up until the end of June. And then we were going to use it for our quarantine, isolation, that's called isolation. Quarantine's just in your room. Isolation was over there. That means if you tested positive. If we filled it up, I was closing down. We never had more than 8 students in it. Never had more than 8 students. And the most employees, to give you an indication, we had 20 employees, most of them, almost all, none got it here. We had 20 employees who have contracted COVID-19, tested positive, right? 20, none here. 9 of them are current. That means that Thanksgiving weekend we were talking about is exactly, in other words, of the, since March, 11 are, and then 9 are just are current. So it clearly, we mirror a little bit what's happening around us. But I think we could have, I think one of the things I encouraged the governor to do, and remember, I was speaking to him in my capacity as the chair of the NJPC, was, and being on the HERAG, on the higher education restart group that Zakia put me on, was quit. You've got to get off of the one size fits all, and you got to show some flexibility for higher ed, because we're not the same. And I can assure you, a large proportion of my population is safer at the campus than they are at their homes. Okay, and that you've got to give us the flexibility to do it, and he did, and he really did carve out flexibility in higher ed, and that took a lot of courage, and I respect him immensely for that. And it really helped us navigate through this. This has nothing to do with what you asked me about. I'm sorry. We're going to have a lot of long interviews if you want, but it's good to know this stuff.
No,
It's
the
a good
point is
start,
that this is going to go in the archive. So that material that you just gave us is going to go in the archive. What is better than that?
And I, like I said, Don, the people, the essential employees, we're all, I say to the cabinet, the deans, if you don't want to be called essential, I don't know why I'm paying you so much. And so the essential employees, the ones that take care of the grounds and all of that, and the plumbers and the electrician, I mean, they've been here pretty much the whole time. I mean, and it's been eerie. I can't stand it, really, Ken and Tom. I mean, it's like a morgue here, and it's so quiet, and it doesn't have its, vibrancy that really was like at its best right before the pandemic. I mean, the campus was like alive and vibrant at night and evenings. The campus, and like all campuses, but we really have seasoned and matured, and to completely change that, almost like a 180. And then how are we going to get it back? And then what is that getting back? And that's where I've now been thinking pretty steadily. What is the new normal? What is this thing normal in post COVID-19 fall 2021 and beyond?
Well, okay. Can we ask you questions?
Yeah, I thought you did, which is why I went off on that tangent.
There you go.
I'm guilty of doing that all the time.
Tom, you're going to start?
Yeah, I'll start this out. Harvey, we wanted to ask you questions that pertain more to your personal career as a student and later as an administrator at Stockton, because you really do have a vision of virtually all of the 50 years of Stockton. We're at a special time. Ken and I talk about this regularly, that at the 100th anniversary, nobody's going to be alive that remembers the beginning. But right now, many people are alive that remember
Correct.
the beginning, that contributed to the beginning. And you're one of the big ones, because you just haven't. Ken Tompkins has been a dean and or a professor for 50 years, but you've run through the entire cycle, from student all the way up to president at this point. So the first thing
I may be the only person ever to be in the inaugural class and become the president. The Chronicle did some stuff looking at it, and Inside Higher Education thought I was, but
right. I think it's likely. One of the questions that we had for you is, we hope you talk about your background before you came to Stockton. Where do you come from? Why did you go to this first year?
that's a really good. That's really interesting, well, I was originally from Philadelphia area, and then in my senior year of high school, my parents moved down to what was called Beach Haven West, right outside of LBI. And I had heard about this new school, but I was going to go to Rutgers. I was going to go to Rutgers because it was in New Jersey. I could get into Rutgers. I didn't really do well in high school because I disliked high school. It was much too constraining for me. You're talking the late 60s, you're talking anti-authority, you're talking all those kinds of things. And I was, I was all of that. And so I really didn't like high school, but I always scored well on standardized tests. So as the person who insisted on going test optional here, I scored well on standardized tests. And so, I would be, that would make you an attractive candidate at a typical, they weren't called R1s then, but at the land grant university at the end. And I knew some people at Rutgers, so that was it. So I was interested in that. But I wasn't, I'm a first gen. I'm a true first gen. My dad only finished like 8th grade. My mom finished high school, which was unheard of back then. I was the baby, okay, much younger. My oldest brother, almost 15, 16. I was the mistake, I wasn't expected, so to speak. And so, I didn't have anyone to follow. My parents said, if we get you through high school, we've done our job. Okay. And it's true. And it's probably true. Particularly when I think about how we sort of do the opposite. Now we coddle, we take care of them all the way through. And so I didn't know, but at the time I was working on Long Beach Island. And I was working at 2 places. I was working at the Acme and I was working at the gas station. This is where you heard I pump gas. As you come off the island in Ship Bottom, it was called Brits Mobile, is what it was called. And it was right across the street. This is an amazing story of the original Ron John's surf shop, which is now nationwide, but it was just a tiny little surf stop right across the street. Okay. And I knew I knew them. Okay. Obviously. And and a fellow named Chuck Tantilla would come and get gas there. And I would discuss politics and things like that. And he always said to me, there's going to be this new school, because this was before 71. There's going to be this new school that's going to open up in Pomona. I had no idea where Pomona was. Okay. You got to understand, you don't know. I would remember I lived in Philadelphia, then Media. Okay. That's where and then we moved down here in my senior year of high school. So I didn't really know this area. Okay. It was sort of like a bolt out of the blue, quite frankly. But he convinced me, okay, to take a look at it. I read the original prospectus, the 71 document that I fell in love with. To this day, I have a PDF of it and I have my original prospectus at home. I fell in love, everything about it says that's me. I belong in a school like that. I mean, it was wide open, completely wide open. It just reeked of experimentation. It reeked of, in a nice reek, okay, of, a place where you truly could, and I hate to use it, plant yourself and grow, where you could really, develop what I loved, the development of your own curriculum, working in conjunction with faculty members. A huge amount of independent study. Is how outgoing as I can appear to be, obviously in this role, and most of you know me, is that I am a very private person though, otherwise, I really am. And yet, even though it's sort of the opposite of my role in many respects. And I love the fact that there was a real emphasis there on, you would find your 3 courses, but you could take an independent study if you found something that really interested you. And at the time, I was very, very interested in the Vietnam War. Okay. And I was allowed to really explore that at a pretty significant level. Also, back then, it was so inexpensive. I wanted to take every course I could possibly take. And we were in trimesters back then, and it was HSN. So there was no real risk to take something out of your, you weren't into the A, B, C, D, worried about where you're going to take it later mode. It was more, you've got this free grading system that you didn't even flunk. I really didn't have to worry about that, but you didn't. It was a no report. It wasn't like that's what it was called. I mean, okay, no report. And there was a real willingness on the part of faculty to let you sit in whether you were taking the course or not. I don't remember, Ken, if you remember having students sit in, but I sat in on a number of courses that I just wanted to be in the class. And then we were also doing Bill Daly particularly, and this is how I got close. Well, I had in the old days, at the Mayflower, you had 2 preceptors, really. You had one that was going to be your major, and you had one that was sort of like your social preceptor, for a lack of a better term. And I had Shelby for that one and Bill for the other one, because my major was political science. And so I had those 2. And if you can, I will never forget as long as I live, the day I came up the boardwalk, because remember, we were sort of surprised. We weren't thinking we were going to open up in the Mayflower Hotel in Atlantic City. We were going to open up here, but then there was a roofer issue or whatever. I'm pretty sure it was the roofers. And they were Philadelphia roofers, and that's another long story, but it wasn't going to be done in time. And I remember coming up, I guess it must have been Tennessee. With St. James in Tennessee was Mayflower. So I was probably coming up Tennessee and walking, and there's and the faculty were literally outdoors welcoming us to the campus. And there was this Shelby brought and I had long hair too, but his was really long. Okay, and he was wearing a leather like sweater, vest sweater, but no shirt. Okay, just bare chested, and then leather pants. And that was my preceptor. And I never said to myself, am I sure I'm in the right place here? Is this for real? And then of course, then I get Bill, who's conservative. You know, he was if you saw Bill today, it was exactly like he was back in '71. He'd have his tie, whatever the situation may be. But Bill was doing two classes, Revolution and the Revolutionaries, and either Politics of the 60s, I think it was called. There were two classes. It might have been Politics of the 70s. I'm pretty sure it was Politics of the 60s, though, but I may have confused that. But it was those two courses. He was doing both as a class, and he was doing it in like the lobby of the Mayflower so people could come in and sit down. So you had the regular people. And remember, this is pre-casino Atlantic City. So you're talking about, you know, if you watch the movie with Burt Lancaster, I mean, you're talking about, you know, it was not at the height of where it was sort of it's the roller coaster that Atlantic City is. Okay. And has always been. It was at one of those, okay, parts of the roller coaster. And so, and you had these like shops along the way where the tarot reading, all the kinds of things going on, right where you were getting educated. And you had students living there, in there, and you had street people living in the Mayflower. So you had all sorts of people coming in and out. You never really knew. You had this wide open. We had the colloquium. You had your preceptorial groups would be meeting. So there was an incredible amount of, a self-defined governance. Faculty at the time, students were on the faculty review committees. They were called that. They were on hiring faculty. I mean, and remember, you had a lot of Vietnam veterans who had gotten a GI Bill. Okay. Who were as older than some of their faculty members who were just, Bjork hired, Dick hired, you know, as Bill would always say, and I think Ken would say, you know, recently minted PhDs, young folk. Okay, they were cheaper, number one. They were more willing to take a gamble because remember, it was unaccredited. I mean, we had every reason to believe it was going to get accredited. There's no way the state wasn't going to, you know, put its resources to make that happen, but it was still unaccredited. So there was an element of risk when you came here, but the reward, when you talk about risk reward, to being part of something brand new, and that's what, you know, makes Atlantic City so wonderful to me from a, you know, historical point of view, to be a part of where you can help design it, where your voice mattered, particularly as it's not only mattered, was encouraged to be a part of it, where you were able, and this is EOF ties in with this a little bit later, where you were able to I truly did get that education that's called the Stockton idea. I did get an Ivy League or a small Ivy, if you want to go to Amherst, at Rotto, whatever. Okay, education at a public college price. I was that kid. I was that first gen kid who was afforded an incredible opportunity to get a first rate education where I could explore just about anything I wanted to explore. Because remember, this was before this was before we had G's, different kinds of G's, but no real distribution requirements. You just had to take 32 credits and whatever. And you had flexibility even within that. So here you are, whatever your interest could be, as long as you found faculty members with that kind of interest. And we were hiring faculty and Ken was part of that, hiring faculty that had not only expertise in their field, okay, but also extraordinary interests outside their field that they wanted to bring to the classroom, which would be the foundation of interdisciplinary studies and the foundation of our general studies program. To be the recipient of that And, people always, what were your favorite courses? It was never the courses. It was always the faculty members. I always picked courses by the faculty members, not by the courses. I mean, I had to pick courses to fulfill the degree requirements, but I meandered a lot because I graduated with like 170 undergraduate credits. It wasn't like I enjoyed the ability to take tons of courses here, and you could afford it then. And so I was able to take a lot of courses from a lot of different people and experience a sense of co-curricular. You see, everyone said we did not have student services. That ran very, very counter to Dick's philosophy, who said the student is an adult. He says, if you need counseling services, they've got counselors all along, in Atlantic City. Remember, Galloway was not built up yet. In Atlantic City, they have counselors there. If you need help, we didn't even have a meal plan. That's why you had apartments. They designed them. It was called landlord-tenant. They wanted you to be like an adult. And that was the relationship, was a landlord-tenant in housing here. And in the old, A through H court, 1,032, but they were all, 2-bedroom, you had a living room, you had a kitchen, you were independent. And Bjork's philosophy was, if you learn it here, when you do go out, when you graduate from here, it's not that much of a jump. It's not that much of a shift. And then the kids who could not get housing here, and remember, we would have lotteries and things like that, then they would just migrate. Remember, this is before Galloway was built up. They'd be in Brigantine. They'd be not so much Atlantic City, but Ventnor, Brigantine, Ocean City. They'd be in all the barrier islands. There would be a lot, even as in Long Beach Island, a lot from Ocean County. We were heavily, of which I was one of them, we were heavily, student body heavily came from Southern Ocean County too. So you had Southern Ocean County, Atlantic County, Cumberland, not so much Salem, Cumberland, Cape May County. That was Stockton territory, period. And the people that we drew from, and many of them, like I said, they were people who were either the locals who were on the islands. They had 3 months a year, and this is part of why our calendar was the way it was. 3 months a year, they would bust their butt to make all the money they possibly could. I'm talking about the families, the businesses and things like that. And even the students when they ultimately worked in the casino industry. And then 9 months a year, it was like you were at Stockton, or these islands were dead and you were the only ones on the islands and things like that. So there was a seasonal, almost like that beach kind of rhythm to the place, all within this incredible experiment. But I cannot overstate the relationships and again, I don't know if it's still, I think it exists now, but on a, how do I say it, not on as grand a scale. In other words, I think virtually every student and virtually every faculty member, and remember, you're talking small. And that was one thing Shelby said to me a few years down the road when we were at an event. He says, Harv, you can't keep the way it was because we're growing. You lose the intimacy of the kinds of relationship. And the faculty were so engaged then. I mean, not that they're not now, because they are, and there's great work happening. And I hate to make any kind of comparison, but the engagement was so interwoven within the fabric of the pedagogy. I can remember extensive conversation. I'm talking as a student now. I had with Bjork, I had with administrators, with faculty members on, what are the best ways to transmit knowledge? I mean, we talked about pedagogy. We really did. And I'm talking as a student now. Now I was a mature student, an engaged student, but by mature meaning that I wanted that. I yearned for that. But I was not unique. There were a lot. And I think that, I mean, even the quality of the journalism, our Argo was an investigative newspaper. I mean, where the Atlantic City Press would use our writers to break stories. I mean, so it was a very intense kind of academic relationship that you had. And it really, when I went into, when I was in EOF, was when that really, I can't even tell you that level of intensity. Maybe I should, unless I've jumped ahead. So
let me jump in and ask you a redirect. We do want to get to the EOF, but I think we're leading there. Can you talk just a little bit about your political science courses? And I presume you didn't think yourself at that point as a student, I'll be a college president. What did you think you were going to do with your political science degree?
You know what? I never looked at, thank you. Tom, for that question. I thought I could, here are two things. I thought I was going to either teach, and I wasn't thinking college level. I was thinking more K-12 level. I was going to teach or I was going to go to law school. And, but I was fascinated with politics. I was fascinated with political science. I wanted to understand how things work, and economics too, but I wanted to understand how things work. And, I really believed that the underpinnings of how things operate are political with a small p, okay? And that if I understood how that worked, I could transmit that knowledge, or I would be more effective in my role as an attorney. Now, this was somebody, again, I didn't know. Right now, I would say be a philosophy major if you want to be an attorney. Be perfectly honest with you, like my son was, okay? Is because I think it teaches critical thinking. I think it teaches a lot of the skills that you do well, that helps prepare you for the bar exam and for law school. But I was fascinated with it. But I was fascinated with the people who taught the courses. Jean Richard. I don't know if you remember him, Ken. And obviously Bill and Alan Arcuri in the second year. He wasn't here the first year. Alan came in 72. Bill was 71. Richard was 71. Marty Miller, who I had. And some of the ones that they were not only into it, they were really engaged in political things. And there's been nothing close. I mean, how do I say it? The divisiveness that we had this year with respect to the Trump and all the stuff going along with that divisive really for the last 4 years, but that came to a height the last year and a half. Okay, there was a sense, even though it was a divisiveness back then between the young and the people in charge, it was more cerebral. It wasn't as, how do I say it? In other words, it wasn't as ugly, meaning that ours, I would say when we were interested in the issues, we weren't associated necessarily with the people. Now, Nixon drew a lot of negative reaction from, my generation, make no mistake, when we were going to school, but not like the divisiveness of the Trump followers, which are not kids. That's the distinction. The majority of the Trump followers, which, the far right, for lack of better, are older. And so that's one distinction. Whereas here, even though there was that same kind of youth versus senior citizen, it was clearly about the war. It was about civil rights. It was civil rights now, no war now. But war was the catalyst to it all. And then came, remember, you had civil rights for African-American, women's rights, all of these, things happening together. That was fascinating politically. How could you not be? And some of the people who recruited the hardest at the beginning were the political science faculty. They went, if you came in to go, and remember, it was in-person registration then, you got to get cards and all that craziness that you had to get. Well, they would be in the lines trying to recruit you to poli-sci. And so, I mean it. I mean, they would take you right out the line. Oh, you can get this course. And I always like to blow off registration, but I talked to Bill first. I said, because why I blew off registration, I didn't want to have to pay the bill until a little bit later. Okay. And if you missed registration, you had the advantage of, if you could get added in, you could pay your bill later, and Bill would always add me in. And so I was able to delay my having to pay, which is one of the things I taught the UF kids later on down the road. So it's how do you use the system, because first gen students don't know that. The parents of first gen, parents who've gone to college know all the tricks, and first gen know nothing. So what's very important about that is the first gen student today and in 1971 is at the beck and call of the university. The university, okay, determines and by that I mean the bureaucracy. All entities become bureaucratic just to get things done. Okay, it's not a bad term. It's a bad term when it's oppressive. It's a bad term when nothing happens, but it's not a bad term when you have to routinize things. I mean, you gotta pay the bills on time. People want their pay on time. I mean, there's a lot of different things that bureaucracy does help us with. And so, but you are subject to it. So if some administrative official says you got to have this done, then you did it because you didn't know that you might have more options. Whereas the kid who's the child of somebody who's going through it the parent can say, oh, no, you can do it this way. Or when I want that, you don't have any of that. So I had to rely on my faculty. I had to rely on my preceptors. And remember, you didn't have a student affairs division. You didn't have, so you had to rely on these individuals, your faculty predominantly, to get you through this. And those relationships that were developed back then, and I'm sure all of you, I know Tom, Ken, absolutely. I was one of them. And I mean, Ken and I go back when we talk about Apple IIe's. I mean, he had the first, I might have had the second Apple on the campus. Okay. And I did a 3 EOF and we would talk. So when you go back, those are the kinds of things. I don't know if it happens. I think it does with you, Tom, and your students, but I don't know if it happens as much across the board. I can't imagine students of today had the kind of relationship that I had with faculty, at least through my formative years here. And that's why I'm saying the education I got really was the Stockton idea. I think it was.
Yep. You mentioned Marty Miller, just as a quick sentence. Marty Miller got a PhD in his teaching at a rich board school.
Lawrenceville School for years. Yep, I know he did. He finished. Marty was, the Patty Hearst. Everybody knows some of the stuff with Marty. But Marty would run the beach. Marty was a runner, if you recall. And we would have class on the beach at the boardwalk.
Right.
And then he'd want to run. You'd have to run with him,
yeah.
Okay, along the beach while you're doing class. And so he was a fascinating person, fascinating. And I remember Candy Falk. I remember this was a very Ralph Bean. I mean, it was going all the way back. Sherm Leibovitz, he may have been a little bit later, but all the way back, we're talking about, folks who, and some of the deans that were from the beginning, folks who were deeply engaged in the pedagogy, in the teaching learning process. Everything from creating, college outcomes in New Jersey was the New Jersey College Basic Skills Placement Test. Stockton was involved with Steve Johnson, all those people from the beginning. We were a leader of the state in all of this, but keep in mind why that's so. We were founded to be different. We really were founded to be different than the rest. We were going to be this school. All the rest were normal schools switching over to comprehensive. They did not have a truly liberal arts and sciences faculty like we did. They never did. They had teacher education, good faculty. I'm not saying that, but they weren't steeped into liberal arts and sciences like our faculty. Okay, and at the height of the availability of PhDs in the United States, so every single position, we had a really good number of qualified candidates to choose from. And I think we did a great job in doing that. I remember so many of the Al Lacey, some people like, but I remember Al Lacey. Al Lacey was somebody I could sit down with and talk with about philosophy, because there was a limit the number of courses I could take, and I leaned towards poli-sci. But anytime I could sit down for a half hour, 45 minutes with Al, I would do it. Even towards literally up until even after he retired, Al and I would connect. And I still to this day go out with Bill, I go out with Bill when I can. And you guys, I've gone out with you guys. So this is the think about that, 50 years. Right. And that's the kind of education that Stockton could always provide. And I do think it still does. I don't know if it can possibly do it for 10,000 students like it could do when we started with 1,000. That's my only point.
Harvey, let me switch this and ask you about EOF. It seems to be a bit of a touchstone in your career. As a student, you're working with EOF, and then you just sort of move into the program and you become an administrator. Yep. Is it true that it was that important to you in your career? And can you talk about that?
Absolutely. The most important experience in my career, bar none. Let me explain why. When I was doing that, I was teaching here. I was teaching finite math as an adjunct. I had finished my credits. I didn't finish my degree. The 79 was because I needed to. Remember, in those days, it was technically your second degree got you your teacher certification. Okay, remember that it was before you could get it within your 4 years and then years before. And so what I did was finish all my regular coursework, but left my teaching stuff for later. And I wanted to be dual certified. I wanted political, well, in those, it was social studies, K through 12 back then, and mathematics. So I had both. So which made me very attractive to the skill center, because you could hire me to do both. And I think I told you this, Tom, and the other one. You could hire me to do both tutoring in the, critical thinking writing lab. And it used to be called the Skills Acquisition and Development Center. And I was one of the few that could go both sides. I could do the quantitative stuff, which also made me attractive to be a tutor in the EOF program. And so by that, I'm a tutor during the summer program. I was already beginning to, I had been hired as a permanent substitute. In those days, Oakcrest and Apsigami, the two regional high schools, shared one building in Mays Landing. It was on dual. It had Oakcrest in the morning and Apsigami in the afternoon one year, and then they switched into before Apsigami was built. And I got hired as a permanent substitute because I had met all the requirements. And those days, you had to get a separate substitute certificate and all that. Okay. And I had been hired to do math in one building during the morning and social studies in the other in the afternoon courses to make enough money to pay for my Stockton to get certified and all that. But in the summer, and I would work at the skill center after school. After school, I would come to Stockton, take some courses, work at the skill center, doing both. So I was constantly doing all that because I really fell in love. And I always worked out. And when I did the student teaching, I asked for what I would call the most challenging students in their districts. I just felt, having been from Philadelphia, having some urban background, that I could connect. And I grew up in that kind of a situation. So it wasn't, foreign to me. Okay. Where it was foreign to a lot of people in South Jersey, but it wasn't foreign to me because of my roots. And I seemed to do well. Now, where I got, what happened was I was asked by Peter Mercado, was then the Dean of Students. Bill Daly was maybe the academic coordinator of the EOF summer program. But they Franklin Smith, they all knew me from my work in the Skill Center, but because the Skill Center was a really vibrant place back then. I mean, a lot of people would go there, students would go there. There was a lot of, energy around the Skill Center back then, and a lot of fun, actually. And so I got hired to be a tutor in the summer program. Now, let me explain what a tutor's role is. It's probably the hardest it was then. Remember, it was an 8-week summer program, 8 weeks. You had one weekend when the students went home, for 2 days they went home. The day began, as you know, Larry James led it. The day began at 6 a.m. But for someone who was coming here, it began earlier because you had to wake the students up at 6. We did some calisthenics as the tutors. Then we walked or ran around Lake Fred. All right, went back to our apartment, showered, came over, had breakfast in G-Wing back then at 8 a.m., had classes from 8 to, here's what it was. You had your math class, you had 2 sections in the morning, 8:30 to whatever, 10:20, 10:30 to 12. And I would sit in both those math classes so I would know exactly what went on. So in the afternoon, so at 12, we'd have lunch. This went on for 8 weeks. So I could observe, I had Frank Soretto, I had Chick Yeager, whoever the math ones were, I had them all. And I would watch them, watch their style, how they work, learn from them. And Frank, by the way, is an extraordinary teacher in that area, just for those. And he taught me a lot about the pedagogy of working with less advantaged students. And then I would be in the afternoon session after lunch from like 1:30 to 3, then 3:33 to 4:30. I would be in 2 separate tutoring sessions that mirrored what I had in the morning. So right there, and then we do dinner together. And then I was the one that was selected to go to the courts and tutor kids at night. So it was a 15, 16-hour day for me, okay, back then. All right. But my goodness, the level of, I would sit there and listen to, and remember all these, and G-Wing was so active and there was so much interaction there, and you have all the faculty would be there, staff would be there. Once in a while, Tantillo or somebody would walk in and everybody would flee or whatever it might be. Students were there. There were a lot of people there. And it was all, we were talking about the politics of the day, but we were also talking about what works. Does this work? Okay. how do we tie what we're learning here into our G courses, into our team talk courses, into our interdisciplinary courses? How do we learn? So EOF became this experiment for best practices. If it works here, it should work for everyone. And so it was an incredible amount of intensity. I mean, Betty Elmore, when she at the head, Rich Elmore was among all of these people who were in, Sean Donaldson, a little later on, were at the top of their game, really talking about and working with how they reach, a targeted population, a population first gen, less advantaged, predominantly urban, but some rural, South Jersey rural. So you had, multiple, predominantly Black and brown students of color, but still not an insignificant proportion of Caucasian also. And how's this experiment, not only in the classroom, how's it going to work out in the courts? How are we going to make it work in the courts? And then, so how does student life tie in? And then on Fridays, so that was Monday, Thursday. On Fridays, we would have a science component, okay, which was great. All experiments, lots of fun. And the students would love it. And we'd have Mike Moffat and so many scientists, Zim, so many scientists would come in and work on that Friday. And then on the weekends, we would only, except for the one weekend they went home, we would go on bus trips. We'd take them to DC. We would take them to Philly. We would take them to play. And with faculty came along. So we would have this almost 24/7, because faculty ran around the lake too. I mean, many of them, not all of them, but many of them came and did that. So you're talking such an intense, and all you were talking about was how do we transmit knowledge in a better way? How do we become more effective and efficient at what we do? And how do we, then incorporate that into career planning without an office? In other words, so that if Ken wanted to sit down with a lit major, say, these are some of the different areas that this takes you, and all those kinds of discussions. So I was learning about student affairs without it being, quote, officially student affairs. And I was learning about pedagogy without me being, sitting in there taking a course in pedagogy, but watching it and being part of it. And I was learning about, endurance and all those words that we say are in persistence, dedication, all those words we say are important, and how does that play into success? And then also how to confront failure, and that failure should not be fatal. And so those were the kinds of things. So how did that ready me? So what happened? So after 2 or 3 summers of this, lo and behold, the casino industry comes, because I started tutoring in 76, I think, 76 or 75, in both in the Skill Center and then in whatchamacallit, EOF. Then lo and behold, Bob Anderson, if you recall, he was the director of EOF, went to Hampton, really elegant guy, great guy. I was his coordinator of residential life. In other words, I was the first live-in to work with, the first, what we now call RA, or complex director, a live-in with the EOF program, because there had been a fatality the summer before, there was no live-in. And they wanted me to be the person. They asked Mercado, Cabello, all those folks asked me, Chick, Bill, you should be the one. You've worked with the students to be here, so we have coverage. Chuck Dantillo was involved in that decision, and I remember the case well. It was a student who passed. I mean, it happens at a college or university, and they wanted to have somebody there who would be there at the night. So I was there, but I was coming in the office, and the office was Upper J Wing. Skill Center was Lower J Wing. It was Upper J Wing, where I worked for a long, long period of time. Ken has visited me there on more than one occasion. And what had happened was, in the summer, those days, and why Vera, who in 83, and I'm moving forward a little bit, but when Vera in 83 comes in, she wanted no relationship with the casinos, because she thought the casinos were exploiting our students, and she was right. That they were coming in, recruiting our students, to be dealers. Because think about it, when the casinos first opened, it was incredibly successful. And there was no labor force here that could person all the tables, run the restaurant, all the different things that were happening. So we were a feeding ground for the casinos. So they were coming in the summers and just recruiting our students away. And so, because they could pay them 3 times what a faculty members would make it. And so, and I'm not making this up. They would pay him. Faculty member may have been making $8,000 or $10,000, and they were making $25,000, $30,000. Okay, so they would just, and then later on, we'd get a call. I don't know how many hundreds of calls. Can I come back? I made a decision. I got involved in drugs. I made a mistake, blah, blah, blah. And we would. But Vera, cut off all relationships with the casino industry. Well, Bob when he was the director in the summer, he said, I want to go get my casino license. And he says, so I'm going to take a sabbatical this summer. He got the approval from, I guess Bob was pre-Vera. It could have been Peter. I'm going to get a sabbatical, and Peter Mitchell I'm talking about. And you run the summer program. You run it. I said, I'm just going to run the summer program. And he said, I said, okay. So thinking, fine. By that time, I had finished my certifications. I'd already had a job in K-12, and I'd been already penned to be an administrator. I taught that 1 year, came to Stockton, was skills center, working after school, things like that. And then they had geared me up to be an administrator. But that summer, I get a call in August. I'll never forget this, from Bob. He says, I'm not coming back, so you should just be the director. I said, I can't be the director. And it is Peter Mitchell. I said, I can't be the director. I have a job. And so I went to Peter Mercado. I said, look, and Peter said, I want you to be the director. Tantillo wants you to be the director. And Tantillo didn't oversee that, but Tantillo was a major force back then. Okay, you two know that. And so, and he said, we'll convince Peter Mitchell to make you permanent. And which Peter Mitchell did not do. I'll never forget it. He gave me one of those, well, they were called, now we call them TESs. It was a 13D back then, temporary position to do the EOF program for 9 months. I said, why the hell should I do this? I'm going to be in a tenure track position at K-12. They're going to, they're definitely already moving me into administration, which I always had a hankering for administration. Why should I take the risk? And it was Peter Mercado who convinced me, just stay, don't worry about it. We'll get to Peter Mitchell. He didn't know really, he doesn't know who you are, blah, 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 blah. All of which was true. So I stayed, but I had to find my replacement to Okrest Apsigami, because the superintendent, I won't say his name, but the superintendent there said to me, Harvey, I'll let you go out of your contract because I had a contract, but you've got to get a replacement. So I was fortunate to find a replacement not for the administrator, for the teaching part. They let me out of my contract there. I get my 13D here. And then I become the director of the program. And that's where I really began learning, how to run almost like a little college, because you have to deal with every aspect of their education, from how they pay their bills to where they reside, to what curriculum they choose, to all the different kinds of things a student who is 100% reliant on the institution has to maneuver and navigate through. And so I figured if I learned it as well as anyone, then I could certainly at least pass that on. And certainly, and this is how Jim McCarthy, Emmett Bach and all them, you may have heard the term "save the children," okay? And that was something I came up with because I had worked all year. And this is how I got the job. This was 1981. 1980 was when they offered me the job, okay, that summer as a 13D. And then midway through the year, it's a true story. When I was in Upper J Wing, okay, there was an outside door that there are two ways to get into my office. One was to come through the office complex and walk to the back into my office. And the other one is I actually had an outside door, okay, that I could sneak out, but I never did, but I could sneak out. All right. So I get a call that the president, and this is Mitchell, is coming down to see you, okay? So he comes in the office complex, right? And I've got a load of ELF students. Anywhere I would go, and Ken can tell you this, anywhere I would go, the ELF students would follow me like I was the Pied Piper. And it was only because, they knew I loved them, and it was reciprocal, and it really was. And so there was a load of ELF students out there waiting to see me, and the president comes in, he sits down, he said, and he comes into my office, he says, you know why I'm here to see you? I said, no, I don't know why you're here to see me. He says, well, I'm hearing a lot of stuff about you. You've got a lot of people behind you who want you to take this job permanently. And I know I only gave it to you part-time. As a 13D, he said, why are all these students here? I said, well, why don't you go ask them why all the students, ask them why they're here. And he did. And he went out there and they said, because we want to be with him. And so he came around the backside, knocks on my door. He says, you're going to get this permanently. So no matter what you hear, you're going to get this job permanently. And that's a true story. But when so I always owed Peter that. That's why everyone said, and I stayed close with Peter even after he left, because he was a person of his word. And that meant a lot to me. And so Peter, so what I was able to do, I worked with the academic coordinator, whoever that was either Alan or Bill or whoever it was, or Frank or whoever, Chick. I worked with them, worked with the housing people. So you were able to get a handle on how the institution operates to the student who needs the institution the most. And that could not have been a better, training. And I was still getting the benefit of the brain power of I was still with the faculty sometimes, as many as 6-7 hours a day, talking about the pedagogy really of that I knew was transferable to any other things that people would teach. That's why I thought it was a pretty strong.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is more than you want to hear, I'm sure.
No, that's what we wanted to hear. I'm watching our time here, and we've got, according to the schedule, about 5 more minutes. I wonder if you could just briefly.
Briefly is really a difficult word for me, but I've been wanting to tell this story for a long time.
We'll pick this up next time.
Yeah, unless Ken, am I driving you nuts, Ken?
I'm sorry?
Am I driving you nuts?
No, you're not at all. I've never heard many of these stories.
Okay.
I want to learn them just like, I learned the other things.
Okay.
I'd like to have you sort of wind up today on thinking about your teaching philosophy. You've been teaching about your teaching. You've been talking about your teaching philosophy, I understand, but you've taught a lot of different courses. You may teach some in the future. Just talk a little bit about Harvey Kesselman, college professor, teacher.
I love teaching. I love teaching more than anything. I miss that the most. I absolutely miss that the most of anything I do. I try to be a teacher as an administrator, to be perfectly honest with you. I really do. That's why I try to mentor people. Sometimes successful, sometimes not. But I could say Socratic method. I'm very interactive. There's no question about that. I ask a lot of questions. I want people to argue. That's why I love teaching courses like argument and persuasion. But it doesn't matter what I teach. If I teach quantitative reasoning, I'm going to come at you to take a look at this graph and tell me what you see. Okay, and so it's going to be a situation where I'm going to posit a ton of questions, and try to really develop their critical thinking skills, try to really develop their, writing skills. When even if it's not a writing course, there's not a course, I don't care if it's a math course where I don't require some writing in it, because I think it's critical. And if nothing else, word problems are obviously good in the mathematical world. And then, and always think about how to do it better. I'm very difficult on myself when it comes to critiquing myself in the classroom. Always was. Always thought I could do it better. Always said, damn, I wish I did it that way. And would sit down with people who knew my style and the like. One of the things when I went to the Harvard leadership thing, when I was provost, and it was not a thing, it was a 2-week residential program for aspiring leaders. The whole thing was done in the Socratic method. So it was really very reinforcing. And there was Jimmy Honan. There were some really, really good people who knew how to do that method, which is not, it is something you get better at with practice. I would always try to get students to, I didn't really care if they had the right answer, if they were thinking about it the correct way. In other words, if they were, dissecting a problem in a way that might not get you the right solution for that one, but ultimately utilizing that kind of thinking will get you 2 options, which will get you ultimately to the right solution. And that was another thing. And it's really hard when you're doing math to do this, is that, there are many different ways to get there sometimes. And so there is no one right way. And one of the things I've always been critical about math instructors, not here so much, but K-12, is if they've only learned one way, that's the only way they can describe it. And if the kid, like I almost have a photogenic mind when it comes to like a spreadsheet. If I see it, it's right there. So I sometimes couldn't explain what I saw when I was in school. Remember I said I didn't like high school? I couldn't really explain it, but I knew the answer, and I knew it. And so how do you get students to look at the world that way? And, so I miss that. Part of why one of the things that Vera saw in me, by the way, because Vera's the one who moved me out of EOF, and she moved me out of EOF and that should be for the next one. The move to director of institutional research was a critical move in my career. And that she did that. And that was the one after EOF and before student affairs. I mean, and I didn't start at the top of student affairs. I climbed the student affairs ladder, but IR was a really important one. And it was my work in EOF that she saw that said you could transfer those skills over to there and be more valuable to the university in that role, because you could provide, in those days, the cabinet was small. It was just the VEEPs, and then she added me to it. So she's the one who brought me in as the director of institutional research to be part of, the big boys and girls table, okay, where institutional decisions would be made. I had to shut up. And if you ever saw my speech at her memorial service here, I speak about one of the things in that speech, and actually is a really important part. I wasn't to talk, I was just to listen and learn. And be around people like it was, whether whoever the VPs were at the time. It could have been Rob Trout, it could have been Phil Manzetta, it could have been whomever it was. I was, climbing a little bit later on. I was the person that she felt that, listen to what's said, listen, tell me what you think. Tell me what you think. And she would spend a lot of time for teaching me the academy from that side. Tenure. And those days we had the tenure guidelines. When you look at tenure, Harvey, you got to look 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, because if we continue to have these guidelines, you don't want this program completely tenured up. So the decisions you make. So all of that part of higher ed, and this speaks to something you guys talked about, that's what, the next role, the director of institutional research role, taught me. And the reason she saw me for that is I would make presentations when I was the EOF director to the campus community, primarily to the board. And she loved the way I would present information. So she said, you present it, and I always took pride in that, in as simplistic a form as possible for people to understand. And it wasn't, I didn't think what I did was novel, and it isn't. But I always thought if I can explain it that way, okay, so that people who don't know, I've always said the gauge is if you can explain something to someone who knows nothing about the issue, that they walk away learning something, then you've done your job. And that ties in what we talked about earlier about the pedagogy. And I learned all of that from Bill and Frank and all the people who exposed me to that kind of thinking, and then applied it to that. And then Vera saw that and said, I'm going to take that to a whole different level. And I'm going to expose him to this, and this. I'm going to take him with me to the statewide region so people know his name. And she, I don't know why she, to this day, I don't know why she did that. And before the archives, not this time, remind me the day before she passed what happened, because it showed how connected we were. And it was sort of like, I mean, it could have been everything from, the Atlantic City, because I did used to come to Atlantic City when I was a kid. Our vacation in our home with my family was 1 week a year, you'd go to Atlantic City, okay? You'd stay in Atlantic Subway and you'd go. So there was an Atlantic City connection I had long before I even knew I was going to live in New Jersey. And so, and of course, she's an Atlantic City person. And we would always connect, even though mine was only a week, but I loved Atlantic City. And I really, like I said, I think she really valued how the students in the UF program valued our relationship.
That's all great. Ken?
Well, I'm just going to say, Harvey, just to summarize a sentence or two, let's start there next time.
Can we?
And yeah, certainly we can. And this has been wonderful and very important, I think. What perhaps you realize.
I can't overstate how much I am the input of all those folks. I just lapped it up. I can't believe, if I had not been given any of those opportunities, I'm talking going all the way back to the EOF program and everything else. Okay. I'm not here. And again, and all of it, helps frame who you are. But one of the things I didn't answer, Tom, that you brought up is that I had no idea never in a million years, in a zillion years, would I think back at the Mayflower that I was going to be the president of that year. No. And I'm not even sure that even became a conscious reality. There's never been a position I haven't liked. I loved being the UF director. I loved being the director of institutional research. I loved everything I did in student affairs. I love being, even in admin and finance, even though it really was transition, it really was sort of what Susan's doing, just to get the university to the new VP long term. But I had some big issues then. And then, which I learned a lot that I didn't know, which is good. And then, of course, the dean of the School of Ed, which probably was in many respects my favorite job because it so closely matched my skill area, if you know what I mean, what I had practiced, that I was able to deal with faculty on a much, much closer basis, but as their dean. And I put forth a number of programs, by the way, during that few years that I was the dean in the School of Ed, the masters, all those master's programs and things of that nature. Okay, but then the provost was a great position for me, and I'm happy. I'm happy. I went through the national search for that, so that validated. Remember, I went through 2 national searches in that 5-year period, one for the provost here, and of course one for the presidency of the University of Southern Maine. And I can't tell you how important being the provost here readied me. Even if I could have been a president before being the provost, not here or anywhere, the provost position really helped me become, I think, a president. It really did, because it was the last piece of the overall puzzle.
We look forward to it.
Okay.
1 week, and we'll 11. I think it's 11, isn't it, Tom?
I think it's 3 o'clock, Ken, but we'll make sure. That's what we'll dig into next week, Harvey.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Listen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Good to see you.